Hello learners, and welcome to the 9th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century women's novels. We have been discussing Nella Larsen's novel Passing. I have provided a brief historical overview to the cultural context in which passing became a very dangerous but also a very widespread phenomena. I have been also discussing the textual dynamics of the text. I have begun reading from the first section of the novel. I have briefly introduced the characters. I have provided a detailed commentary and reading of the first chapter and briefly introduced the second chapter. I will continue with somewhat of a zoomed-in view of the text in this and the subsequent lecture before wrapping up and summarizing the remainder of the novel in the next few lectures. So, before I continue with the textual reading, and this is a very important chapter, it's one of the longest chapters in the novel, chapter 2. This is the chapter that establishes for the first time in all of their psychological complexity the dynamic between these two individuals. It helps us appreciate ultimately the tragedy that the novel describes, and it helps us appreciate the full extent of why that is a tragic event. It describes to us the social milieu from which two very ordinary human beings emerge, and how these two ordinary human beings are propelled into an extraordinary circumstance, that it helps us understand that in some ways it was inevitable. The social and historical and legal conditions of the time make it inevitable that there would be two individuals who would get entangled in this manner and who, simply by being human, would propel themselves into this kind of a tragic entanglement. It's not that they do anything unusual. It's not that they get up and they decide to do something strange or radical or unprecedented, which produces the tragedy in which they're caught up. No, in fact, they are very ordinary human beings and they are living very ordinary human lives. And it is the choices that they make as human beings which propels them towards a condition that we cannot, at the end of the novel, but call tragic. And so the power of the narrator and the novelist lies in describing how ordinary lives and everyday choices can take a set of circumstances and make it tragic. And this tragedy has to do with the history of race relations in the United States, and it has to do with the particular forms of liberties and discriminations that the ascendant Black middle class enjoyed in the early 1920s. Now, one important theoretical idea, rather a cluster of theoretical ideas, that I want to briefly introduce before discussing the text further is that of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a group of thoughts that are associated with the work of the scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's safe to say that at the time that this novel was written, there was nothing even remotely resembling intersectionality in the intellectual and cultural context. In fact, not only intersectionality, but even the very basic ideas of critical race theory, feminist theory, feminism even, civil rights, women's equality, all of these intellectual movements can be said to have begun properly after this novel was written. In fact, Nella Larsen, as an intellectual, anticipates these intellectual movements of the 20th century. Nella Larsen did not live to see civil rights or women's rights become a reality in the United States. But we can trace very clearly the seeds of these liberationist ideas in this novel. So the same goes for intersectionality. However, reading this novel carefully and reading the way these two women, three if you count Gertrude, who's introduced in chapter 3, Irene, Claire, and Gertrude, simply reading the way these individuals negotiate the different defining aspects of their lives, the way they negotiate identity, it's very telling, and it helps us anticipate the most powerful ideas of intersectionality. So what is intersectionality and why is it important? Speaking very generally, and we don't have time in this lecture to go into a detailed study of intersectionality, so I'll summarize it very briefly. Very briefly speaking, intersectionality suggests and persuades us to think in a certain way about identity. The word that can be used to understand the way different identities interact in order to produce a holistic human identity in the perspective of an intersectional approach is to say the word can be compounding. Identities compound each other. And the final effect of any human individual, the choices that an individual makes as they go about their everyday life, those choices are the consequence of the compounding of multiple identities. So it is not that a woman thinks as an African American individual in certain contexts and forgets that they are African American in other contexts and becomes solely a woman. Rather, they are always everything at once, and how different aspects of their identity become either dominant or residual at different circumstances, at different junctures in their lives, that is always a matter of negotiation and persuasion. So in certain contexts, the African American aspect of a woman's identity might be dominant. In certain other junctures, the feminine aspect of a woman's identity may be more dominant. But both of these aspects are always present, and they are never acting in isolation. This is one commonsensical way in which we can understand the concept of intersectionality and how it helps us appreciate the workings of human identity in a holistic manner. So that is one thing that we will constantly remember, especially when we reach chapter 3, in which there's an encounter in which Claire invites Irene to her house, virtually forces Irene to visit her. And while at Claire's house, Irene meets Gertrude, another woman who is on the spectrum of passing, who passes occasionally in certain contexts, not permanently like Claire, but is definitely on the spectrum. And these three women encounter Claire's husband, John Bellew, who makes some extremely grotesque and quite horrific statements which describe the intersection of race, sexuality, and his own attitude of disgust and violence towards these aspects of human identity. As this tea time conversation takes place, each of these three different women have different relationships to the kind of horrific statements that they are forced to hear and they are forced to tolerate. However, each of them negotiates her disgust and her anger towards these statements in very different ways. And the fact that ultimately they don't come together, ultimately solidarity remains a distant dream. They all notice that they feel a sense of disgust, but they never come together. They never put their anger together to form a solidarity which can have a consequence in the world. They remain isolated. Their anger remains a private emotion. And this is ultimately the tragedy. But in the way the narrator describes that tea time conversation, it is a very prescient description of intersectional identity and the way identities come together in this very, very fraught and precarious time. So that is one concept, intersectionality. The other concept, it's not really a concept, it is more of a tendency and a phenomena that has become very popular. But I noticed that it has a great parallel and it gives us a great perspective with which to appreciate how race is a reality for individuals in this novel. The tendency or the phenomena that I am referring to is that of pronouns. Now, many of you might have noticed that in the recent past, it's a trend that began a few years ago and is beginning to become more and more popular everywhere. And the tendency that I'm referring to is one in which individuals introduce themselves and also provide the pronouns with which they would like to be referred to by others. And this is a phenomenon that has caught on in some parts of the world, but some regions, some spaces are quite resistant to it. And naturally, the debate that this has produced is also very predictable. The group of people who criticize it or who don't believe that everyone should be free to choose their pronouns seem to dismiss it as too individualistic and as something that's a consequence of identity politics or is too much of a privileged or capitalistic tendency. I'm not going to engage with that because I don't believe in that and I'm quite sympathetic to the use of pronouns. I'm simply going to quote from a recent scholar's view on this, and I'm going to use that view to help understand the way race functions as an important structuring principle in the lives of these individuals. So recently, the scholar, professor, and writer Judith Butler gave a talk at the London School of Economics in which they were describing their new book, that is, Who's Afraid of Gender? And in the Q&A after that talk, one of the members of the audience asked what they thought of pronouns and should they be allowed or should they be legitimized with a more institutional backing. And the answer they gave is quite prescient. It has stayed with me and I kept thinking about it while reading and thinking about this novel. The answer that Judith Butler gave about pronouns was that they're not simply a choice. In fact, it may look like a choice that someone is simply choosing a pronoun, but they're actually an individual's way of, in fact, and I don't have the exact quote, but I think their response was something to the effect of pronouns are an individual's way of saying to others that this is how I would like you to treat me. The pronoun is an individual's giving a means to others to engage with them. So when an individual provides pronouns, they are asking others to treat them through a particular lens. Individuals give others a means of addressing them, a means of relating to them, a means of acknowledging them as real individuals. So pronouns are really a way for individuals to inhabit the world as real choice-making, rationality-bearing entities. So it's a way of making oneself real, available for others. So it's a profoundly ethical and sympathetic act of imagination. Now, this idea, if we take it a little bit backwards in time and we think about the way race works in this novel, and in fact generally also, we can find a lot of parallels. Why am I saying that? It is not that Claire Kendry simply chooses to become white because in the time that she is living, white women were allowed certain advantages, certain material comforts that other people had. It's that Claire Kendry wants to be a certain kind of individual. She has a certain idea of what good femininity consists of. Whether it means being able to go to certain restaurants, whether it means being able to wear certain dresses, whether it means having the freedom to choose certain things, whether it means having the freedom to choose a profession that gives her more dignity than some other forms of labor. It is all of these things, but it is not the desire to be white. However, it just so happens that if she allows other people to recognize herself as a white woman, then others would treat her in a way that would make it possible for her to have those things. So this is the negotiation, this is the deal, this is the contractual understanding. However, while Claire makes those choices and passes, right, there remains for Claire the flip side of that as well. So the opposite of that understanding is also real. And what is that? The opposite of that is that Claire is able to have relationships with certain individuals with whom she is able to have all of those benefits of whiteness, so called, right? Even when these individuals perceive her not as white, or not white in the way that strangers, anonymous people, or her husband perceives her, but they perceive her as the Claire Kendry that they knew before she had started passing. So it creates a profound contradiction in the very perception of race. And it presents to us an occasion to understand race as fundamentally a problem of perception. But also, because it is a problem of perception, it becomes deeper than that. It is not just a problem of perception, but it represents a problem in which what begins as a question of perception, that is, a theoretical question of whether a person is identified as white or black. Race may be said to have begun as a question of perception, but ultimately, because of the systemic, historical consolidation of racial differences, this question becomes much more than a perceptual question and becomes an ontological question, becomes a question of reality. And so the problem or the struggle that is triggered at the rooftop restaurant, the Drayton, when Claire meets Irene and is able to reconnect in a way that bypasses all of the constructed perceptions of her whiteness, right? The problem that is triggered after that Drayton rooftop conversation is a problem of ontology. Claire Kendry is thrown into a question of confusion about who and what she really is. It's not that she has any doubt about the lineage or the genealogy of her origins. She knows that her mother was black and her father was white, and so she has light skin and so on. And she can calculate in a mathematical way the percentage of whiteness or blackness in her genetic makeup, for instance. That is not a problem. But the problem is that in her everyday life, because of the way different perceptions allow her to inhabit different realities, she's confused about the reality of herself. And this is deepened because the woman with whom she feels that sense of belonging, that's Irene Redfield, is someone who has not made those choices. Irene does not pass, and Irene is quite scandalized by the choices that Claire makes. In fact, the reason for the scandalized reactions that Irene has have to do with the association of passing with certain kinds of material benefits, but also a perception of the way, being a woman, Claire might have used her light skin, her appearance. And the association which makes it scandalous is an association with the deployment or the use of sexuality in order to make herself attractive to white men. And that's exactly what Claire has done. Claire has married a white man, and it has come with all the benefits that this kind of a thing usually does. But from the perspective of Irene and a more conservative black middle class perspective, this comes very close to a kind of prostitution. Although the word prostitution is not used, the kind of malicious gossip that alienates Claire and which forces Claire to disappear from their lower middle class, working class black neighborhood and to never come back, the kind of malice that's produced because she's sighted with white people and in expensive restaurants with white men suggests that even though the word prostitution is not used, the implication is that it is something like that. So this is a great ontological question. Claire doesn't know who she is, and she latches on to Irene. There is a great deal of attraction, but the attachment is not simply attraction. The attachment that Claire foists onto Irene has also a great question of survival attached to it. In fact, it can be argued that Claire attaches herself to Irene because she glimpses an alternative mode of being real. She glimpses an alternative ontology. So I'll stop the theoretical discussion at that point and continue with the textual discussion. So there is a great deal of anxiety at the restaurant when these two women sit down and start to catch up. The anxiety has to do with Irene's trouble about whether or not she should ask the question. What is the question? There is one question which Irene really wants to ask, but she's scared of asking because she fears it might be too impertinent. And that question is, has Claire passed? That is, has she pretended to be white, and has she allowed white people to accept her as white and thereby move higher, move up in terms of economic power, material comfort, cultural and social ascendancy? Has she really done that? Because she is too scared, too worried, and too obsessed with knowing, she is in fact spared the trouble, and Claire answers the question herself. And this is the remainder of the chapter describes a very important conversation in which the two women exchange views, and it becomes an intellectual debate almost about the efficacy, the ease, the utility, the value, the morality, or even the ethics of passing. Now, combined with this kind of an intellectual inquiry, there's also a somewhat subdued, somewhat unconscious, but equally powerful and unmistakable tension that's running throughout this conversation. And that tension has to do with Irene's perception of a power of attraction from Claire. So on one hand, Irene intellectually considers herself superior. Irene occupies the moral high ground. For Irene, she is morally unimpeachable herself, whereas Claire has committed a kind of sin. Claire has sold out. Selling out, assimilation, these are very powerful concepts in African American culture. And in this historical context, Claire's decision puts her in a very low position, intellectually and morally speaking. And Irene very comfortably occupies that moral high position. However, this moral high position and the power it should give Irene is severely undercut by a sense that Irene has of being less empowered because of the kind of gaze she finds emanating from Claire. And I use the word gaze very carefully because this is a kind of powerlessness that Irene feels when she notices the way Claire looks at her. And it is in the way that Claire looks at her that Irene begins to feel at first disempowered, because she begins to feel that she is maybe the object of desire. And it's not spelled out in these words, and I'm getting ahead of myself. This is what I'm saying is the cumulative effect of events and descriptions that can be got from the whole book. And this is, in a way, retrospective because I'm revisiting the scene from what I know of the book as a whole. But it's a very powerful element of this novel. And the reasons why Irene feels both pleasured and as well as disempowered is because it's kind of validation that Irene did not expect that she would want, and once she had it, did not know that she would actually enjoy. And what is that validation? It is the validation of finding herself, possibly, potentially, finding herself desired by someone who is perceived as a white woman by the society around her. So this is the first reality of Claire and the dynamic between the two, which has a very strong shaping influence on Irene. The second is that it makes Irene guilty that the person of whom she thinks so less, intellectually speaking, morally speaking, for Irene, Claire is the person who turns her back to society. For Irene, Claire is selfish. For Irene, Claire is someone who cares about nothing but her own emotions. She wants a dress, she steals money from her father, that kind of thing. She wants certain things, she wants the good life, she passes and runs away from her neighborhood. For Irene, Claire is selfish. But to find herself desired, if not desired in this moment, then to find herself the object of a possibly desiring gaze. And if the word desiring is too strong, we can say that at this point, Irene finds herself the object of an affectionate gaze. There is something in Claire's gaze which is comforting to Irene. And I'm calling it desire because it is desire, but at this point, the narrative spoken and written from Irene's perspective doesn't call it desire because it is not acknowledged. The conditions do not yet exist for it to be recognized as desire. But there is something quite affectionate and validating, and the first instance of that is in these words. And she, that is Claire, she gave Irene a curious little sidelong glance, and a sly, ironical smile peeped out on her full red lips, as if she had been in the secret of the other's thoughts and was mocking her. So there is a kind of violence in this sentence. The violence has to do with the kind of awareness that Claire has of the kind of hypocrisy, judgmental attitude, and views about race and segregation that Irene has. Irene feels known, Irene feels exposed because Claire has seen through her judgments and doesn't care for them. This is part of the violence. But along with this violence, there's also something that's very pleasurable. Irene enjoys being exposed. Irene enjoys her hypocrisies, her double standards, her incomplete thinking being identified and called out by someone like Claire. And what is this someone like Claire? Claire is extremely attractive. Claire is very good looking. She was born black, but has all the features of white femininity and also enjoys the economic and cultural privileges of being white. This is a very powerful dynamic, and it is so powerful and so overpowering that Irene struggles to admit it even to herself. And one can argue that the whole book, that the whole short novel, is a powerful and sensitive description of an extremely conservative woman's struggle to accept that she has the opportunity to challenge some of these very conservative forces that have shaped her. And in some ways, this makes it, and that, if we can read passing as that kind of a description, it makes it an extremely powerful and among the most strong inaugurators of the intellectual tradition of 20th century Anglophone women's prose writing. I will continue with this description in the next lecture. Thank you.